The snow came down sideways that night, and Amara Adeyemi was running. Her sneakers slapped against frozen concrete in a back alley behind Itaewon's main strip, her breath tearing out of her in white clouds, her nurse's badge still clipped to her scrub top under her coat. She had clocked out 40 minutes ago. She should have been home. Instead, she was sprinting toward a shape slumped against a dumpster, a shape that hadn't moved when she first spotted it from the street, a shape she'd almost mistaken for a pile of garbage bags until she saw the hand. A human hand, blue at the fingertips, palm open in the snow like it was still reaching for something.
Sir.
Sir, can you hear me? Amara dropped to her knees beside him, ice biting through her jeans instantly. The man was maybe 35, maybe younger. It was hard to tell under 3 days of frost-stiffened stubble and a coat too thin for the weather, a coat that had clearly once been expensive, now torn at the shoulder seam. His lips had gone the color of a bruise. His pulse, when she found it, was a thin thread, fluttering and slow. Hypothermia. Severe. Possibly hours from a coma his body wouldn't come back from. She screamed for help. Nobody came. The street noise from the main road swallowed her voice whole, and this alley, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, was the kind of place people avoided on purpose. Amara had exactly one thing most people wouldn't have had. 6 weeks ago, she'd given birth to her nephew's daughters. No, that wasn't right. She corrected herself even as her hands moved on instinct, stripping her coat off and wrapping it around the stranger's shivering frame. She was still nursing her own son back at her sister's flat, was leaking through her shirt most days from the sheer overproduction her body still hadn't calmed down from. Her grandmother's voice rose up out of some old, dust-covered part of her memory, a story from a war-torn Igbo village decades before Amara was born, a story about a woman found dying of cold and starvation on a road outside Enugu, and the nursing mother who had knelt beside her when there was no broth, no formula, no time, and given the only thing her body had ready to give. Colostrum. Sugar-rich, calorie-dense, immune-loaded liquid gold that had, according to every version of that story Amara had ever heard, pulled a dying stranger back from the very edge. Amara didn't have broth. She didn't have time. She had a body that had, for 6 weeks, been making exactly the kind of emergency fuel a starving, freezing, unconscious man's blood sugar was screaming for. She didn't think about how strange it would look. She didn't think about anything except the thready pulse under her fingers and the fact that in 10 more minutes it might not be there at all. She pulled him half upright against her, tilted his head, and did the only thing she had left to do. It took less than 90 seconds before his throat moved.
Swallowing.
Alive. If your heart just skipped a beat reading that opening, comment, "I'm still watching right now," hit subscribe, and let's find out together who this man really was. You will not believe where this story goes. /B. 10 minutes later, sirens finally cut through the snow, someone from a nearby noodle shop having spotted them and called it in. Paramedics swarmed the alley, wrapped the stranger in heated blankets, started in 4, murmured words like miracle and just in time as they loaded him onto a gurney. Amara stood back, soaked through, teeth chattering, watching the ambulance doors swing shut on a man whose name she didn't know. She never got the chance to ride along. A second call came through on the paramedics' radio. A car accident 3 blocks over, casualties, all hands needed, and in the chaos of triage decisions made in the freezing dark, somebody handed her a blanket, thanked her for calling it in, and the ambulance pulled away without her. She stood there a long moment, arms wrapped around herself, watching taillights disappear into the snow, and told herself that was the end of it. A stranger she'd saved. A story she'd tell no one, because who would believe her, and because some things you did quietly and let go. She did not know yet that nothing about that night was going to let go of her. Amara Adeyemi had come to Seoul 4 years earlier the way a lot of decisions get made, half out of desperation, half out of hope. She'd grown up in Suka, the second of 5 children, her father a schoolteacher whose salary never quite matched the size of his family, her mother a trader in the market who could haggle a stone into giving change. Amara had wanted to be a doctor since she was 9 years old, since the night her little brother's fever spiked so high their mother wept openly on the walk to the clinic, since she'd watched a nurse's calm hands bring a boy back from the edge of something terrifying and thought, quietly, fiercely, I want to be the hands that do that. Medical school in Nigeria had been a fight she'd nearly lost twice, once to money, once to grief, when her father passed during her 3rd year and every part of her wanted to come home and never leave again. She'd finished anyway. Then a nursing exchange program had opened a door to South Korea, a 2-year contract at a hospital in Seoul that turned into 4, a life built slowly out of double shifts and broken Korean, and a studio apartment she shared, for the first 2 years, with a cousin who eventually moved to Busan for love and left Amara alone in a city of 10 million people where she still, some nights, felt like a ghost nobody could quite see. She was good at her job. Better than good, the kind of nurse doctors specifically requested for the hardest cases, the kind whose hands didn't shake even when a patient's did. But good at your job and living the life you dreamed of at 9 years old were not the same thing, and Amara had learned, slowly and without much drama, to let that particular dream shrink down into something more survivable. She sent money home. She read novels on her one day off. She had, 6 weeks before that snowy night, become an unofficial Annie to her sister's baby, staying up nights so her sister could sleep, her own body responding to the constant closeness of a newborn the way bodies sometimes do, a small, strange gift she'd never expected to need for anything but comfort. She thought about the stranger in the alley more than she wanted to, wondered if he'd made it, wondered, with a small, embarrassed heat rising in her chest at 2 in the morning some nights, what his eyes would have looked like open. Her closest friend in Seoul, a fellow nurse named Grace who'd emigrated from Lagos 2 years before her, was the only person Amara told about the alley, and even then only in fragments, over instant noodles in Grace's cramped kitchen. You did what? Grace had said, spoon frozen halfway to her mouth, and then, when Amara explained, haltingly, half expecting judgment, Grace had only nodded slowly and said, my grandmother used to tell a story just like that, about a woman on the road to Onitsha. Some truths Amara was learning, traveled further than she'd ever guessed, carried quietly from one African grandmother's kitchen to another's, across oceans and generations, waiting for a night desperate enough to need them again. You'll never see him again, Grace said, not unkindly. That's usually how these things go. You do the good thing, and the universe doesn't even give you the courtesy of a thank you note. Amara had laughed and agreed and told herself Grace was right. She went back to her 12-hour shifts, her Sunday visits with her sister's baby, the quiet, orderly rhythm of a life built out of discipline and distance from home. She did not expect the universe, this time, to prove Grace wrong. 3 days after the alley, a black car with tinted windows parked outside her apartment building for 4 hours and left without anyone getting out. She noticed it because her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Han who spent her days at the window like a sentry, mentioned it over the mailboxes with the particular relish of someone who'd found something interesting to report. Fancy car, Mrs. Han said, squinting. Didn't move all afternoon. You know someone important, Amara SS. Amara laughed it off. Coincidence, she told herself. Seoul is full of expensive cars and bored drivers. The second time it happened, 4 days later, she was less able to laugh it off, because this time a man got out, tall, dark suit, sunglasses despite the overcast sky, the unmistakable stillness of someone whose job was to stand very quietly and watch. He didn't approach her. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at her across the parking lot for a period of time that felt, to Amara, like it stretched past the boundary of anything casual, and then he got back in the car, and it pulled away. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the dark running through every version of what this could mean, and none of the versions felt safe. B. The tension is only getting started. If you want to know exactly who is watching her, don't scroll past. Like this video and let's keep going because what happens next changes everything. It was 2 weeks after the alley when the truth finally found her, and it did not knock politely. She was walking home from a night shift, exhausted in that bone-deep way 12 hours of critical care leaves you, when the black car pulled up beside her on a mostly empty street and the back door opened without her touching it. "Get in," said a voice from inside, low, accented, careful in a way that suggested the English was chosen deliberately for her. "Please. I only want to talk." Every instinct in Amara's body screamed to run. But something in the voice, Serranis underneath the control, made her hesitate half a second too long, and in that half second, the man leaned forward into the streetlight, and she recognized him. The stranger from the alley.
Alive.
Upright. Dressed now in a coat that fit him the way expensive things fit people who are used to having them, his jaw sharper without 3 days of frost on it, his eyes a dark, steady brown that found hers and did not let go. "You saved my life," he said. "I would like the chance to say thank you properly. And I would like to explain why that has apparently made your life more complicated. I am sorry for that. Truly." His name, she learned in the following 20 minutes, sitting rigid in the back of a car that smelled like leather and cedar, was Ji-hoon Choi. He did not dress it up. He did not soften it into something more palatable. He told her plainly, watching her face for the reaction, that the organization his father had built and his older brother had died defending was the reason a black car had idled outside her building, was the reason a bodyguard had studied her face across a parking lot, because the men who wanted Ji-hoon dead had, in the last 2 weeks, begun asking questions about the nurse who'd been seen dragging an unconscious man out of an alley 3 blocks from where rival soldiers had left him to.
Freeze.
"They think you know something," he said quietly, "about where I was those 3 days before, about who moved me, who hid me, who helped me survive long enough to be found. You don't know anything, but they don't believe that yet. And until they do, you're not safe, and that is my fault, and I intend to fix it." Amara sat very still, her pulse loud in her own ears, and understood with a sinking clarity that the story she'd told herself, stranger, saved, forgotten, was never going to be the whole story. Some kindnesses she was learning follow you home. The weeks that came after moved fast and strange. Ji-hoon was, by his own quiet admission, a man who had spent his adult life trying to walk away from the empire his family built on fear and debts collected in blood, an empire he'd inherited not by ambition but by the brutal arithmetic of who was left standing after his brother's assassination 18 months earlier. He told Amara this not as an excuse, but as a fact laid on the table between them, the way you'd set down something heavy you were tired of carrying alone. He'd been ambushed the night she found him. His own convoy, his own driver, turned by a rival faction that wanted the Choi organization's territory carved up while it was weak. He'd escaped with nothing, wandered half-conscious through back streets for the better part of 3 days evading men hunting him, and collapsed in that alley believing, in whatever fragment of thought his freezing brain had left, that it was where he'd die. He did not expect a stranger with gentle hands and old family wisdom to change that ending. Amara found herself, against every rational instinct her medical training had ever drilled into her, unable to simply walk away once he'd explained. Partly it was practical. His enemies had already marked her as a loose thread, and Ji-hoon's protection, however uncomfortable to accept, was more reliable than pretending the danger away. But it was more than that, and she knew it, and hated a little how easily she knew it. There was a gentleness in him that didn't match the world he came from. The way he asked permission before every small thing, the way his hands, when he finally reached for hers weeks later in a quiet moment neither of them planned, trembled slightly, like a man unused to wanting something he was afraid to break. Grace was the first to notice the change in her. The way Amara had started checking her phone more, the faint, distracted smile she wore on her walk into the break room some mornings. "You're seeing someone," Grace said one afternoon, not a question, and when Amara tried to deflect, Grace only raised an eyebrow.
Amara.
"I have known you 2 years. You do not blush over a chart update." Amara didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Not the parts about black cars and zip-tied men and an empire built on debts collected in blood, but she told her enough, and Grace's face, over the following weeks, moved slowly from delight to a careful, searching worry that Amara recognized because she felt it too, most nights, lying awake turning the whole impossible situation over in her mind. Their conversations, stolen in guarded cars and the back rooms of restaurants his men swept for threats twice before he'd sit down, ranged from cautious to unexpectedly raw. He asked about Nsuka, about her father, about the 9-year-old girl who'd watched a nurse's hands work a miracle and decided that was the life she wanted. She asked, carefully, about his brother, about the weight of a legacy he'd never asked for, about whether a man born into that world believed there was any way out of it that didn't end in a grave. He told her one night about the day his brother died, a phone call at 3 a.m., a hospital corridor identical to the ones Amara worked in every day, a father who had aged a decade in the space of that single conversation and never fully recovered. He told her about the funeral, about standing at the front of a room full of men who called themselves loyal and watching, in real time, which of their faces were already calculating what his brother's death meant for their own ambitions. "That is the day I understood what I had inherited," he said. "Not a business. A war that never officially ends, only pauses between funerals." Amara had reached for his hand without thinking, and he had let her hold it for a long time before either of them spoke again. "I used to think there wasn't," he told her once, low, in a car parked in the dark outside her building while his bodyguard stood watch a respectful distance away. "Now I am less certain. You climbed into a freezing alley for a stranger and expected nothing. I've spent my whole life around people who calculate the return on every kindness before they offer it. I did not know your kind of person was still real." She told him, quietly, that kindness that calculates isn't kindness at all. It's a transaction wearing kindness's clothes. He was silent a long time after that, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. "Then let me try," he said, "to offer you something that isn't a transaction. Whatever that costs me. This is the part where things get dangerous, and it's about to get much worse. Comment below if you think Amara should run, and stay close because the twist coming up changes the whole story." The danger Ji-hoon had promised to shield her from arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the alley, while Amara was closing the register at the small pharmacy where she picked up her sister's prescriptions. She heard the shop bell first, then felt it, the specific, skin-prickling wrongness of men who had walked in not to buy anything.
There were 3 of them.
The one in front had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and the flat, unhurried manner of someone who had done this exact thing many times before and expected no trouble from a pharmacy clerk and a tired nurse. "You're the one who found him," the scarred man said. Not a question. "In the alley. You know where he was those 3 days. Who moved him? Who's hiding what's left of the Choi organization's money?" "I found a dying man and called an ambulance," Amara said, and was proud, distantly, of how steady her voice came out even as her hands went cold. "That's the entire story. I don't know anything else." "That's not what we hear," he said and took a step closer, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and something sharper underneath it, something like violence held on a short leash. "Choi's been spending a lot of time around you lately. Man like that doesn't waste time on people who don't matter. So either you know something and you tell us now, or—" The shop's back door slammed open before he finished the sentence, and 4 of Ji-hoon's men filled the small space with a speed and silence that told Amara, in one cold flash, exactly how many times a scene like this had played out in Ji-hoon's world before tonight. There was shouting in Korean, fast and furious, a scuffle that knocked a display of cough syrup to the floor in a crash of glass, and then, abruptly, the scarred man and his two companions were on their knees with their hands zip-tied, and Ji-hoon himself was standing in the doorway, chest heaving, a look on his face Amara had not seen there before. Something past anger, into a territory that frightened her a little even as it was, unmistakably, on her behalf. "Are you hurt?" he said, crossing to her in 3 strides, hands hovering just short of touching her, as if he needed permission even now, even in the wreckage of a pharmacy with 3 of his enemies bleeding on the floor.
Amara.
"Look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she managed. "I'm fine, Ji-hoon." He turned back to the scarred man with an expression that made even Amara's steady nurse's hands tremble, and said something low and final in Korean that she didn't need translated to understand, was a warning that would not be repeated a 3rd time. Then he had his men clear the shop, had a doctor from his own payroll check Amara over despite her insisting she was unharmed, and did not let go of her hand. Not once. Not for the entire hour it took for the adrenaline to finally drain out of her legs and leave her shaking in a back office chair, his coat around her shoulders the way her own coat had once been around his. Grace arrived 20 minutes later, having gotten a call from Amara's shaking fingers before Ji-hoon's men had even finished clearing the glass off the floor, and stood in the doorway taking in the scene. The zip-tied men, the armed guards, the composed, dangerous stillness of Ji-hoon crouched at Amara's feet, with the particular horror of a friend realizing the danger was worse than anything she'd imagined. "Amara," she said, voice tight. "Amara, what have you gotten yourself into?" It wasn't an accusation. It was fear, plain and unhidden. The fear of someone who had crossed an ocean with this woman and did not want to lose her to a war that had never been theirs to begin with. Amara didn't have an answer that would make either of them feel better that night, and she didn't try to invent one. "This is why I should have kept my distance from you," he said quietly, kneeling in front of her chair, his eyes dark with something that looked almost like grief. "I told myself I could protect you, without pulling you further in. I was wrong. Every day you are close to me, you are in danger, and I have no right to ask you to accept that." Amara looked at this man, a man who had trembled reaching for her hand, who had held vigil outside her building not to threaten her but to guard her, who had built walls of quiet strength around a wound she suspected he'd never let anyone see before her, and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was no longer the frightened bystander in this story. She had chosen, in a snowy alley 3 weeks ago, to reach toward a stranger without calculating the cost. She was not going to stop choosing that now. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said, and took his hand in both of hers, steady now. "I climbed into that alley because it was the right thing to do, not because it was safe. I'm not walking away because it's gotten harder. Whatever this costs, let it cost both of us together, or don't ask me to disappear." Something in Ji-hoon's face broke open then, some final wall he'd been holding since his brother's death, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because nothing needed saying. The weeks that followed were not easy. Ji-hoon spent them dismantling, piece by piece, the rival faction that had ambushed him and marked Amara as a target, a process that involved negotiations Amara wasn't privy to and outcomes she chose, deliberately, not to ask too many questions about, because some kindnesses require you to accept that the people you love live in the gray, not the light. But slowly, the black cars stopped idling outside her building for threat and started idling there for comfort. Ji-hoon, some nights, simply sitting in the passenger seat outside her window until she came down, not to guard her, but because he wanted to see her face before the day ended. She kept her job. She kept her sister's baby in her arms on Sundays. She did not become, as she'd half feared in the frightened early days. A woman defined entirely by the danger of the man she'd chosen. She remained, first and always, the nurse whose hands didn't shake, the girl from Suka who'd watched a stranger's miracle at 9 years old and decided that was the life she wanted. Ji-hoon, for his part, began, slowly and perfectly, against the grain of everything his world had taught him, to build something around their relationship that looked less like a transaction and more like the thing Amara had told him kindness was supposed to be, freely given, without calculation, without a ledger kept. Grace, over time, softened from fear into something more complicated. Not quite approval, but a grudging respect for how Amara carried it all, how she never once let the danger swallow the woman underneath it. "I still think you're insane," Grace told her one evening, months later, watching Ji-hoon wait patiently in the car outside while the two friends finished their tea. "But I have never seen a man look at anyone the way that one looks at you."
So,
Maybe insane and lucky aren't so far apart. Amara had laughed, really laughed for the first time in weeks, and thought that maybe that was as close to a blessing as she was going to get, and that it was enough. There were harder nights too. Nights when Ji-hoon came to her apartment with new bruises he wouldn't fully explain. Nights when Amara sat awake calculating, with the clinical precision her training had given her, exactly how much danger she was willing to hold before it became too much. She never found a clean answer. Love, she was discovering, rarely offered one. But each time she thought of walking away, she thought instead of the alley, of the choice she'd made in 90 desperate seconds without calculating anything at all, and she understood that some choices, once made honestly, ask you to keep making them, again and again, for as long as they're worth making. Months later, on a quiet evening with snow falling outside her window again, softer this time, without the desperation of that first night, Amara would think back on the version of herself who'd knelt in a freezing alley beside a dying stranger, certain she was making a choice that would end there, in that moment, forgotten by morning. She understood now what her grandmother's old story had really been trying to tell her all along, the lesson underneath the folk medicine and the war-torn road outside Enugu, that the kindness you give without expecting anything back has a way of finding its way home to you, multiplied, in forms you could never have predicted the night you gave it. Not every act of mercy asks for something in return, but sometimes, if you are lucky, and if you are brave enough to let it, it gives something back anyway. A life saved becomes a life shared, and a stranger in an alley becomes the person who will stand in your doorway every night after that, unwilling to leave until he's sure you're safe, unwilling, even now, to take that safety for granted. If this story moved you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment telling us which part hit you hardest. Like this video if you believe kindness always finds its way back. We'll see you in the next story. /B